Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live podcast here on Ellen Allen's Substack. I am your friendly host, Ellen Allen, and I thank you for tuning in, for listening on the replay, and for your engagement here. And this is the podcast where we talk about the fundamental truths and the deeper root issues that underlie music training, being an artist, being a performer, and being a singer. I am a professional classically trained singer myself and a multi style voice teacher, and I am also a content creator here on Substack and elsewhere. So, today, on this very snowy, wintry day here where I am north of Boston, we are talking about growth mindset in music lessons. And we're going to dive into this a little bit because I think it's an important topic for both teachers and students to consider when a student and a teacher are deciding whether they want to enter into that relationship professionally with each other and fulfill those respective roles. Because, I think a lot of the challenges that we see in private music training, one to one music training, especially in the voice teaching world, where obviously is where I have the most experience and where I have, the most amount of colleagues, as it were. Uh, Especially in those circles, I think a lot of the challenges that we see teachers and students face are they can be boiled down in many cases to a lack of clearly communicated expectations around what lessons are about and what the expectations are for each party. So it's really important for us to know what that is. And of course, every teacher uh, has, their own studio. They have their own background, their own experience that they bring to their teaching and their own expertise and their own expectation for how their students are to grow and progress and engage in their studio. So that is, of course, all very individual, and every teacher needs to find a style that works for them and that is going to work also for the type of student that they are teaching. But I think that there are sort of like, again, root fundamental issues that we can look at that can address some of the common challenges that we see teachers presenting with in regard to their students. I see a lot of the same sort of recurring themes and questions come up in voice teacher forums, both sort of the open public ones on Facebook and smaller, subscription style groups that I am a part of. And a lot of it has to do with, my students aren't practicing. Um, my students aren't into the repertoire that I'm giving them. They don't wanna sing the songs that I believe that they should sing. They aren't completing their assignments. They don't wanna do warm-ups. They don't wanna do music theory, all of these things. And, this puts teachers in a really difficult position, obviously, because, we want our students to grow and excel. And for us as professional musicians and professional educators, we know what the ingredients are to being a successful musician and being a successful music student, right? Being a successful aspiring professional. We know what the standards are and what these ingredients are. But how do we communicate that to our students in our studios, especially our younger students if we're working with children or teens? And how do we get them to um, adopt these things not simply as I must do this, I have to do this, my teacher's making me do this. How do we get them from that mentality to these things are going to help me grow as a musician? They're going to help me grow as an artist and grow as a human. They're going to help me become more expressive. um, they're going to help me reach more people with my music. Um, and you know I think this is a really important thing for both students and teachers to consider. So we're going to dive into one of the things. We're going to start with one of the things that I often notice teachers in voice teacher settings talking about, And that is the idea of practice expectations. So last week on the podcast, I talked a bit more extensively about my own background as a young musician growing up doing rigorous violin training. And you can hear much more about that on that podcast. You can visit my page and check out the episode. Um, but I bring this up again only because as teachers, as voice teachers, all of us have our own experience and our own lens that we bring to our studios when we decide that we want to become teachers. And this was one of the lenses that I was working through when I first started working with young students over a decade ago at this point, probably close to 15 years ago. Um, and that's because from the very earliest days of my violin study, I was this itty bitty 4-year-old doing Suzuki violin training. Um, my teacher clearly communicated to my parents, probably not my 4-year-old self at the time, but my parents who were paying for the lessons and supervising my practice. My teacher communicated very clearly what the practice expectations were and what the growth expectations were and what the progress expectations were. So my teacher and my parents made sure that I practiced and they made sure that I did it in the way that was prescribed and that was appropriate for the level that I was at, because they cared about my musical development. Um, my teacher was even very specific about how to practice things, how many times to practice things. Like you must play this passage 10 times. You must do it 5 times in a row with no mistakes, that kind of thing. It was very, very rigorous. Um, Sometimes it was about targeting a specific technical intention. Sometimes it was like intonation. Sometimes it was just plain getting the notes right, right? And my parents and my teacher, they made sure I did this because they cared. They cared that I was growing as a musician. But if you are a person who has taught young musicians for longer than approximately 5 seconds, you know that it's very challenging at times to get them to practice. And there are a lot of reasons for this, and the reasons are as varied as the students themselves. And I certainly saw this over the course of my own career as a music teacher. So, like I mentioned earlier, I started out teaching students of all ages. I started working with students as young as 4 or 5 years old, and all the way up through adults. And when I first opened my studio, I taught not only voice lessons, which is what my degrees are in. But I also taught violin because I had this extensive background and became quite advanced as a violinist myself. And I also taught beginning to intermediate piano because I had some experience there as well. So a lot of my instrumental students were young students. My violin, my piano students were the little itty bitty kids, and my voice students tended to skew a bit older. But I really had a range of students of all three instruments across the age spectrum. And I did this for over a decade before I decided to zero in my focus and teach voice only. So now in my voice studio, I work pretty much exclusively with adult students, and some of them have performing and pro aspirations, and some do not. And I work with the occasional conservatory bound high school student who say wants to go to music school for classical singing and wants to put an audition package together and things like that. So that is my background. That is the lens through which I'm talking about these things. So even though I do not work with young students anymore, I did for many, many years. And I think that the things that we're talking about in this podcast, as far as growth mindset and expectations, apply not only to young students, but to older students as well. So whether you are a teacher or a student listening to this, or neither, maybe you are an artist yourself. Uh, but artists are always learning, right? We are always growing. We are always improving at our craft and improving at what we do. So I think that this has a sort of wide application. What we're talking about today. So going back to the practice expectations here, right? I certainly saw over the course of my own career as a music teacher working with young students that this was sometimes an issue, right? And you do your best, you do your mighty best to explain to students how to practice, what to practice. You make the assignments, as clear as you can, as, feasible and achievable, as you reasonably can. Some teachers, implement external reward systems like stickers or prizes and things like that. I know I did that with my very young students for a while. But despite all of this, sometimes students still fail to meet our practice expectations as teachers. And they come to their lessons week after week and they simply just like repeat the same content over and over again. Right. And that is frustrating for us as teachers and it is frustrating for them because they're not progressing. And so in those cases, inevitably I would ultimately approach the student or their parents or the student and the parents together and just be honest about what was going on, about, how there didn't seem to be a lot of practicing going on. The student is not progressing, after a number of weeks or months working on the same music or the same concepts. And often, with many of these families, the end result would be the parent pulling the kid from lessons because it was obvious to the parent, or so they thought that the kid didn't like it. They didn't want to put the time in. And the parent wasn't going to waste their money on, music lessons if their kid is not practicing. Uh, so that I think is an experience that all, music teachers who work privately with young students can relate to. It's very hard to get them to practice consistently. But I think we even see it with older students. We even see it with adults. And adults understand that their progress is their responsibility, right? I think that's the main difference. Is they will acknowledge that they didn't practice, and they own that as their own issue, right? But I still hear a lot of I didn't have time, right? Life got in the way. Something came up. These reasons that I hear from my adult students that make it difficult for them to practice. And, they have a desire to grow and improve, but, life does tend to get in the way sometimes. And, one could argue that, all of these reasons or like, excuses or whatever, they're all rooted in some kind of truth, right? Excuses are not always just made up. They're not always they're not always, like, passing the buck or shifting the blame, right? Maybe the students really didn't have the time. Maybe they don't really like the instrument that they're studying. Maybe they're more passionate about something else, and they would rather spend their time doing that thing. Maybe they really did forget, right? And before they knew it, lesson day rolled around again, and, they hadn't practiced at all between their last lesson and the next one. And, some of these things are really forgivable. And in fact, many of them I'd say are very forgivable, especially if they occur only occasionally, and the student is making consistent progress otherwise. But I do think, because I'm always looking at the human nature things that are underneath these things, um, I I would argue that like a lot of these reasons that students cite for not practicing are not often the root reasons for a lack of practicing. And we're gonna get into that in a little bit. I think there are really 2 main overarching reasons for that. But first, I wanna take a brief excursus into something more generally, and that is to say that practice expectations, we need them, right? They are not optional, they are essential, right? You'd think this would be, like, a really obvious thing. Because as musicians ourselves, the teachers, we know, that improving at any skill requires thoughtful, repeated, engaged practice, right? And yet, over the past, I would say, like, 5 to 6 years, I have seen more than one conversation in various voice teacher forums and spaces that I'm in online over the past few years, asking whether practice expectations are really necessary, especially when it comes to young students. And I saw this becoming more prevalent during the pandemic, which makes a lot of sense, right? Um, we were all kind of surviving, right? We were all sort of figuring it out as we went. We were all sort of building the plane as we were flying it. So we did make a lot of allowances and accommodations for students back in those days when, people were shifting from doing things at school or offsite at work to having to do these things at home now and manage their families at the same time. Many students found their routines, kind of upended. It was hard for them to practice at home because of everything else that was now going on at home versus going on in places outside of the home. So we did, I think, make some necessary accommodations as an industry, as a culture for these people. Um, because we were all struggling, right? The teachers were struggling. I remember, myself. I remember the difficulty of those days and, the adversity that we all faced on a collective level and our own personal circumstances on top of that. But I see that, now we are, nearly 6 years removed from the initial lockdowns of the pandemic, and I still see, that a lot of this accommodation, a lot of this excuse making for students who aren't practicing, and we just are continuing. I say we, again, like, as a voice teaching industry, as a private music teaching industry, we are just continuing to allow them to show up to their lessons week after week um, without having engaged with the material at all, without having thought about their instruments at all in the intervening week between lessons. They haven't done any of the required assignments or, looked at any of the material that we assign. And we just kind of started letting them scuttle along with no real consequences for having completed their expected assignments in like a satisfactory manner. So, I think that this is reflective of sort of a broader culture of this happening. For example, like my husband is a middle school teacher. He teaches grades 5 through 8 in an elementary and a middle school. And he sees this kind of thing all the time there as well. And he teaches in a private school, not a public school. And I think that there are, some good things at the root of this approach. Like we really do want to understand each student's situation and the reasons that they might not be able or willing to complete, the assignments that are asked of them, whether it's music lessons or school. Um, but I think that, we also as educators can't throw standards out the window. And in some cases, this is kind of what I see happening. Um, my husband and I were in our later 30s and we grew up in the 90s and we talk about our own experiences with education growing up. We both studied instruments. We both, went to rigorous schools and had, parents who were very invested in our growth and in our development as humans. And, so our training, our upbringing was, quite rigorous in that regard, and we, look at what we see happening in our respective fields now, him in education and me in music teaching, having a private studio, and we see, significantly lower academic expectations, um, you know, it rather than schools equipping students with the tools and the mindsets that they need to meet reasonably high standards, we're kind of just letting those standards go. Instead of, supporting them as they work through the failures that are part of the learning process, right? Instead of doing that, we're just sort of, you know, there's no natural consequences for anything. There's no imposed consequences for anything. Um, Behavioral infractions are often treated the same way. They are addressed very inadequately or not at all. And it creates a very disruptive, dysregulated learning environment. And I think that is true whether it is a classroom full of 35th graders or a one-to-one student teacher dynamic. When the teacher seems unable or unwilling to give the student the support that they need to overcome challenges and instead just eliminates challenges altogether, I think that that leads us to a very not a very good place as educators. So I see this happening in the wider culture and I see it spilling over into private music instruction. Um because, going back to the voice teacher forums that I see online, I see posts from time to time about how do I get my young students to practice? How do I get them to complete the assignments and sing the music that I know is going to help them build technical skill instead of pieces that they would rather sing that are maybe too difficult for them or that are too complex or whatever. Um, there is always at least one person in the comments of these posts who says, is it really necessary, though, for young students to have so many practice expectations placed on them? And, we should keep the bar really, really low because we don't know what they're facing at home. Like, we don't know if they might be neurodivergent. We don't know, XYZ. Like, we don't know their situation. So we should just keep like bare minimum expectations because of what we don't know. And all that is true. Like, we cannot know the entirety of a student's situation. It is not our job to diagnose undiagnosed neurodivergence or learning disabilities. Um, and maybe there are teachers out there who like truly don't care whether their students practice or whether they progress at all. Like, maybe it doesn't bother them to repeat the same content week after week in lessons. Um, I maybe there are those people. I was never one of those teachers. I know from speaking to many colleagues that they are not those teachers either. I think this is not the majority of music teachers. I think that most of us feel, on some level, that we became musicians and we became teachers because we viewed it as a calling. We viewed it as a vocation of sorts, right? And teaching, as an artist, is its own sort of like very, very noble, specific calling. And most teachers would agree that, we care about young people having music in their lives. We care about we care about this aspect of cultivating a well-rounded human being. We know that the arts are important for that and music is important for that. I think we also realize that, it involves the development of like a lot of different skills to be able to do this. And that a lot of those skills also are applicable to things other than music. There are a lot of skills that you learn studying music that are across, they're transferable to other disciplines or other things you might do in your life. And this is why I think a lot of teachers want their students to grow and improve. They don't actually want them to come back week after week, never practicing, repeating the same lesson for months on end because they've continually chosen not to practice. And I think also, importantly, music teachers know, as professional musicians themselves, that music is its own field and its own discipline with its own set of standards and expectations, right? And these standards, of course, they vary across different sectors of the industry. Nothing is a one size fits all. Like, blanket statements are, not helpful in this regard, I think. But I think there's a general consensus among music teachers that music is an art form with its own expectations and its own traditions attached to it that deserve to be kept and imparted to the next generation. So, this brings me to the first reason among many that I think it is necessary to have practice expectations and to uphold them. And that first reason is we want people to we want music to be taken more seriously, right? You hear it all the time, like, oh, people don't take the arts seriously enough. Like, people don't appreciate music. People don't appreciate musicians. People don't appreciate artists. And it's true. Unfortunately, we live in a society that takes art for granted. I think that if many people stopped and thought about it, they would develop an appreciation for the art that they consume, whether that is music or film or visual art, dance, any kind of entertainment that they are exposed to on the regular. I think if they really thought about it, they would see the benefit. But because we are inundated, especially now, with stimulus and entertainment everywhere coming at us like from all sides, out of our phones, out of our TVs, out of our computer, like, it's everywhere. it's much, much easier to take that for granted and to develop this sort of like it cheapens the value of entertainment and art in some people's eyes, I think. And so we want music to be taken more seriously. That is the thing that we want. It is the thing that we lament about our culture. If we want people to take music more seriously, no matter the genre or what they do with it, then we need to teach it to children in a way that will help them to take it seriously and help their parents to take it seriously. So this is why I think holding students and even very young students to practice expectations to some kind of reasonable standard with their music study is necessary because it teaches them that music is a serious, legitimate discipline worthy of our study. So this is the first reason why it's essential to have practice expectations for your students. Because music lessons, they are not simply a safe space where students can just show up and have fun singing or playing their instrument with whatever music they want for an hour a week, with no accountability between what happens between sessions. What happens with their practicing. Uh, they can be that. They can be a safe space for students. They can be a space for students to have fun. But I don't believe that that is its primary purpose. That is not the primary purpose of a music lesson. I think that there are other ways, if they want to engage with music where those are the primary goals, there are other ways that they can do that. But if they choose to work with a professional, an expert who has honed not only the skill of playing or singing their instrument, but also honed the skill of teaching and imparting skill to other people, because that in itself is a whole separate skill set than just, being proficient on an instrument. If you're choosing to work with a person with that level of experience, then you are assuming for yourself a relationship that requires that you also bring something to the table. Because I think music lessons are ultimately they are a space where people are meant to learn to grow and improve their skills in this area that is worthy of study so that they can be more well-rounded human beings, right? So as much as our students might have goals like they want to land the lead in the musical, they want to get the solo in choir, they, want to play in the next level orchestra, like, whatever. It could be anything. They could have many, many reasons for coming to music lessons, but the fundamental reason now, I'm not saying that those reasons aren't valid because they absolutely are. But the fundamental reason that those reasons rest on top of has to be I want to get better at a skill. I want to get better at playing an instrument because it is good for me to do that as a human person. It is good for me to grow, to build skill, and to engage with art in a way that will allow me to improve, will allow me to widen my perspective of the world around me, and will allow me to realize, learn things about myself and about other people. Um, and when we think about what learning requires, right, it requires work. It requires thoughtful engagement. It requires challenge, and it requires failure. Learning requires failure. Failure is a requirement of learning. It is part of the process. It is an essential part of the process. It involves trial and error. It involves healthy curiosity, all of these things. And all of these traits are things that young people and older people alike must continue to cultivate their entire lives, right? And young people will probably not attain these mentalities or these mindsets without the help of an adult to guide them, whether that is their music teacher, their teachers and mentors at school, their parents, whoever. Um, they are not going to develop these things on their own. They need to be guided by an expert hand in the learning process. So if young students, are not putting in the work week after week with they're practicing, month after month, year after year even, right? And it's probably partly because there is this lack of, you know, um this lack of guiding hand that has held them truly accountable to the standard of this work. And no one has explained to them why it is important that we do this. So, the second reason I think that these practice expectations are necessary is that young musicians are the future of the music industry, right? So, of course, like, not all of our students are going to have professional aspirations, right? They may not even have collegiate level aspirations. That does not mean that we don't treat them like aspiring musicians. Just because they don't want to do it as a career, or as, have it as like a permanent part of their lives into adulthood, does not mean that we don't treat them like musicians and serious ones. Because, music lessons are the building blocks for the music industry, right? So, not all the people are going to want to pursue music at the industry level, but some inevitably will, right? And when we don't have standards in place, or expectations in place, it does these musicians a really, really great disservice. We talked about this a little bit last week on the podcast when it comes to music theory training, especially for singers, and how there is just a dearth of this kind of training built into private voice study, and how that is a complete disservice to singers who end up going to college for music, for example, right? That's a very specific example, but when we're talking about just practice expectations more generally, they need to realize that if they want music to be a part of their life in a serious way into adulthood, right? Then, um, they need to understand that there are standards and expectations that they will be required to uphold once they get to that level. They should be expected to sing or play at a very high level once they, progress to that point in their journey. Um, and even if they don't decide to be professional musicians, even if they never do music again after high school, say, like, they at least have an understanding of the standards and the expectations associated with music, with the art form that they're studying, which only serves point number one, helping people to take music more seriously generally. If you spend time studying something, even if you don't continue to study that thing for the rest of your life, studying something at a deep level, even if it's only for a period of a few years, gives you a deeper appreciation for that thing and for the people who do that thing. Um, so I think that having more rigorous standards is not something that we should shy away from, even for students who do not express a desire to continue with music beyond high school. And this was certainly the case for me, right? Going back to my training here for a second, I advanced as a violinist as I got through middle school and high school, and my training became more rigorous as I progressed. And my peers and I were playing at an exceptionally high level for our age. And it's not because we were all expected to go on to be professional violinists. Most of us didn't want that. That is not why the standards were so high. It was just because that high level was simply the standard. It was simply the expectation. If you want to play at that level, it doesn't matter what you want to do with music. What matters is how you do the music, how well you do it, what you bring to it. So if we want music to be viewed as this essential fabric of our society and develop a greater appreciation for the arts across the board, then, we need our training to reflect this from the very beginning. So this is why we need to hold our students, even very, very young students, in their own way to practice expectations. Because when it comes down to it, music is not just another fun activity for kids. It can be fun. It is fun. Some kids do find it a lot of fun, but that is not its sole purpose. That is not its raison d'etre, as it were. Music is its own field and its own discipline and needs to be treated as such and communicated as such to children and adults who wish to study it. And I think that you could make this case for any kind of activity that involves a skill or a craft, like visual art, martial arts, dance, certainly, various sports even, because all of these, like music, can be done by hobbyists, by children, and they can also be done by professionals at a very, very high level. Um, and students who start these things young as beginners, and continue to do these activities, they're expected to progress, right? There are standards to which they are held, and sort of benchmarks that help them determine whether they are like on track or making appropriate progress for their level and for their ability, right? Someone who practices martial arts long term is expected to advance in the belt system, right? Someone who practices gymnastics is expected to progress beyond the basics of just walking on the balance beam to doing all the fancy tricks on it. I don't know anything about gymnastics, but you get my point. And I think music study needs to come with the same expectation, because there are certain skills that you have to learn if you want to do music long term. And simply saying that students, don't need to develop these skills, or that we can just let them scuttle along if they're not putting in a good faith effort, that's a disservice to them, and it's also a disservice to music itself, and to the people who do it as a living, who are clamoring for more respect in what they do. So teachers, that all this doesn't change, though, the facts on the ground, right? That teachers are like, well, what do I do with these kids who don't practice? um, and again, we're not talking about, the kid misses 1 week of practice, or they, like, we're talking about kids who choose not to practice at all continually over the course of like weeks or months or even years. And like, I've seen it. I know my fellow voice teachers and instrumental teachers, frankly, have seen it as well. So we're not talking about the isolated sort of like, oh, the kid had a bad week and he didn't practice. We're talking about you come week after week and you literally haven't progressed because you don't put the time in. What do we do with these people? My younger teacher self, when I was first starting out, might have had a different answer to this, but now, having been at this for a while, I'm of the opinion that if a student, and especially a child, has shown themselves to be so disinterested in their instrument, such that they do not engage with it at all between lessons for an extended period of time, and if the parents and the teacher have taken reasonable measures to help the child cultivate the skills required to practice and progress, then it's time for a conversation with the student and with their parents, perhaps, about why the kid is still in lessons and whether their time might be spent better building some other kind of skill, doing some other kind of activity. Especially if the kid is old enough to understand conceptually that getting better at anything requires practice, right? This is a conversation that you can have, even with children. Um, if they're like really young, like say, like 7, 8 years old or younger, I would have a conversation with the parents and ask how involved and invested they are in the child's practice process at home. Because young students, again, music teachers know this, young students can generally not be relied upon to take the initiative when it comes to their own practicing. And they need frequent reminders from parents or from caretakers. But you would be surprised also at how many adults just simply assume that their children will be self sufficient practicers from day one. I saw this all the time. A 6, 7, 8 year old would come to me and start lessons, and the parents would not take any responsibility as far as making sure the student was practicing in the way that they should, or even practicing at all. I saw this again and again and again. And it was mind-boggling to me because when I was that age, my parents were very invested in my practice process. They made sure that I was doing it and doing it right. And even after I was, self-sufficient enough to practice independently, right, and didn't need supervision to make sure I was learning the techniques correctly, they would check in. They would read the assignments that my teacher wrote down. in my assignment book, and they would make sure that they heard me practicing the things that I was supposed to be practicing. And it's mind-boggling to me that most parents do not realize this. I'm not talking about parents who are, really busy, like, don't have bandwidth, don't have capacity, that kind of thing. I'm talking about they just leave their child to decide whether or not they are going to practice and, do not check up on them in the way that they would about, say, their homework at school, right? Or about any other sort of, like, very urgent, important thing that they needed to do. Because that's the reality. Young children, um, require hands-on involvement to some degree when they are very young in the practice process to ensure that they are doing things in a way that is going to be beneficial to them and that will allow them to, progress. Um, so if the parents, and or the child do not recognize that this is a necessary part of the process and they're not willing to invest that time at home, then probably now is not the right time to be in music lessons, right? And maybe they should wait until a later time. Maybe they should explore another activity. It is up to them. But it would seem in that case that music lessons are not the right fit for this child right now. So I hear, you know, a lot of arguments from the other side that are like, well, isn't it better that they be doing music than not? um, I hear things like, my students come every week and they just love singing their favorite songs so they can release stress and decompress. And I know that they need this and I hate to turn them away. So I understand that level of empathy, but I would respond with two things in this case. So the first is that I would invite you as a music teacher to consider what your scope of service is as a music teacher. Your job is to teach them something, right? Which means that they are there to learn from you. The student teacher relationship is a two-way street. It is not teachers giving, 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 and students taking, taking, taking. Students need to give also. They need to come to the table with something. So I see lots of shifts toward, student-centered learning, student-centered teaching. And I think some of that is good. There are, again, some very, I think, laudable root principles underneath some of these shifts. But even if you're going to use terms like student-centered teaching or student-centered learning, it still implies that these two roles exist. It still implies that there is a teacher and it still implies that there is a student and that each has their respective role in the process. And if the student is not allowing you as a teacher to teach them, if they are not holding up their end of the bargain to be a learner in your studio, then it's no longer a student teacher relationship. It is something else. And that does not make it good or bad. It just makes it different. And we need to be thinking about what falls within our scope of service as music teachers. And we need to be thinking about what falls in our own zones of excellence as far as how are our own personal skills going to be best used and how can we best serve the student with those skills. Um, and in those cases, it might be good for us to consider that the child might be better served or helped better in another medium or another forum if they are using lessons only as karaoke hour where they can show up and sing for fun. Because the second thing is if a child is looking for that kind of release through music and they're using it as an outlet to decompress or to de-stress or whatever, they don't need a voice teacher to help them do that. Perhaps what they need is music therapy. Perhaps they can just sing on their own, engage with music on their own time in their own way in order to experience the stress relief that they are looking for. Um, I think that music is a powerful tool to help us process what is going on in our lives. And I think that is that is a benefit of studying music, and it is a benefit of teaching music. But when you are in a learning environment, um, you aren't there primarily to use the music to process your emotions and work through adversity in that space. I think that you can use the tools you learn in that space to do that in an environment that is appropriate. But when we think of our scope of service as music teachers, we aren't there to help them process things. We aren't there to help them, you know, work through trauma. And I think that we need to be very careful about that because we can absolutely have empathy for them. We can absolutely be mentors for them. We can absolutely, provide insights and observations that are, seemingly independent of the music. We can absolutely be a person who can impart life lessons to them. Um, but your primary job as a music teacher is to teach them music, not to do any of those things. Even if the vehicle through which that is occurring, in other words, the music, um, seems to be doing that, or seems to be related to your area of expertise. Because unless you have a child psychology background or a mental health professional background, you should not attempt to foray into this area of the child professional relationship. We should not do this. It is not within our scope of service as music teachers, unless we also have that background. And some people do, but many of us do not. And we need to recognize that boundary. So if a student is only using their lessons as a chance to decompress, to de-stress, to process trauma, to process hard feelings, and and is making that very apparent uh, to us. We need to recognize where our boundary is as far as how much we choose to engage with that, and how much learning or not learning can occur in those kinds of situations. Because in those kinds of situations, I think students probably need, again, a different forum for help, not a music teacher who has a specific who has specific parameters around their area of expertise. Because, the other thing is like your skills as a music teacher, they're really valuable, and you probably worked really hard to build these skills. You probably practiced for hours. You probably invested tons of time and money into music lessons at some point in your life to be able to do this. And I think that for all of those reasons, for all the dedication that we have put into it personally, um, we get to decide how to use our skills in the way that we truly want. And if working with certain students is not the way that we want to exercise those skills or choose to exercise those skills, then we do not have to. We can choose to place ourselves in settings and to work with students where our skills will be maximized. And if your skill level, if your skill set enables you to work really well with those itty bitty students and, encourage them to practice in their own way and to learn and grow in their own way, then great. If you find yourself being really frustrated with that kind of clientele, who, who don't seem to be able to be held to the standard that you want, you have every right as a music teacher to seek out students who do. And I think that's a truth that we need to acknowledge more, is that our strengths and skill sets as teachers are not all created equal. And we are all different, and we all have different passions, and we all have different backgrounds and levels of experience working with different skill levels and different ages. And even those of us like myself who have worked with students across the age spectrum and across the skill spectrum, there is a sweet spot for your skills where they are best maximized. And I realized what that was for me and made changes in my studio to reflect that. And I wish that more teachers would do that. I wish that more teachers would stop, putting up with behavior that they do not like in students or their parents, and decide to use their skills in a way that is going to make them feel really passionate and on fire about what they do. Because there was a lot of music teacher burnout, and a lot of it comes from a mismatch in student and teacher expectations of each other. No matter how clearly you might communicate that, and many teachers do communicate that clearly, but you are always going to get some people who do not understand or choose not to understand. And I see a lot of burnout coming from that mismatch. So if we can really double down on our scope of service as music teachers and really look at where our skills are best maximized and make adjustments in our own studios and in our own businesses that reflect that, I think that we can avoid a lot of music teacher burnout. And this is just that's just the mindset piece, right? That's not even like logistically how you do it, like what you do from a business standpoint, um with marketing and policies and boundaries and all of that. This is just the mindset thing that again needs to underlie all of the decisions that you make in how you relate to your students, all the decisions that you make as a music teacher business owner who works with people. And if that means that your passions really lie in an area other than teaching music, and you'd rather help young people in a different way, right? Then there's no shame in that. That is absolutely fine and that is wonderful. But we just want to make sure that we define clearly what that way is, what that modality is, and what is in, again, the scope of service of someone practicing that modality. If it's not voice teaching, it's a different modality. So, what is that scope of service? How is it different from a voice teacher or a music teacher's scope of service? Okay, so that is all to say why I think it's really, really necessary that we have these practice expectations for our students and that we clearly communicate them, and that when we don't see these standards being upheld in a chronic fashion, in a consistent fashion, that we do something about it. Okay, so what are the reasons then that students might not be practicing? Because again, these are the root issues, right? All the excuses that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, which are sometimes legitimate, like they forgot, they didn't have time, something came up, lots of life happened this week. All of those are legitimate reasons for somebody not practicing, but if they are used as excuses in an ongoing fashion, it means that there is something else underlying that, and that is what we have to figure out. And the first is, we've kind of already alluded to this, that the student just might not have the right mindset approaching their music lessons. And by not having the right mindset, I do not mean that their goals or their motivations for pursuing music are necessarily wrong because, like I said, people have many reasons for enrolling in music lessons. I work with so many teens who take lessons because they want to land the lead in their school musical. They want to go to college. They want the solo in choir. Again, like there are so many reasons that they might want to come to lessons. Those reasons are totally valid. They are not wrong at all. But again, the student needs to understand that at the most fundamental level, whatever their personal goals are, the overarching goal, the first and foremost goal, you know, is to get better at music. That's why you go to music lessons. The primary goal is musical skill building in service of the student's other goals. And I think that is where the disconnect sometimes happens, that mismatch sometimes happens. The student sees the goal, getting the lead in the musical or whatever it is. They do not see the musical skill building in service of that goal. They're trying to just serve the goal directly. They don't understand what needs to underlie the possibility of that goal even happening, of that goal even being realized. And they don't understand that skill building, as we already mentioned, requires like thoughtful engagement frequent practice, and a growth mindset. So when I say that they don't have the right mindset or they have the wrong mindset about music lessons, I mean that students who do not approach their lessons with a growth mindset are going to be a mismatch for the setting that they have chosen because they will be unwilling or unable to meet the teacher's expectations because they don't, first and foremost, have a desire to grow as a musician. And that is fine. If they don't wanna be a musician, if they don't wanna develop musical skill, that is fine because there are other things that they can spend their time doing that are worthwhile, that will give them transferable skills to other areas of life. It does not have to be music. But if they choose music, they need to understand that the primary purpose of music lessons is musical skill building in service of their other goals. So I think that students who approach the lessons with a growth mindset, they're the ones who will excel no matter how talented they are, no matter like if they're great practicers or not. The excellent practicers will certainly excel more, but even those who are not amazing will still excel if they approach their lessons with the right mindset. If they approach it with the mindset of, I'm here to grow and improve at a skill, right? And you can grow and improve at a skill regardless of your talent level, regardless of your natural ability. I think of, hobbies that I have enjoyed doing as an adult. Um, I love kickboxing, for example, because it requires that you build a lot of different skills at once, strength and balance and coordination, cardio, stamina, and overall fitness, right? And you have to continually work to improve at these things if you don't want to hurt yourself. When you're hitting a heavy bag with gloves on, the risk of injury is very high. So the level of skill involved in not, you know, getting hurt requires that you invest and get better. So before COVID, I was going to the gym, like 4 times a week and boxing. And now I have a bag in my basement, and I still do it there. Because, there are other benefits of exercise, right? To sort of make a comparison, right, between music and fitness. There are other benefits to exercise, right, that people talk about, like increased overall fitness, right? Mental health benefits, you know, coordination, whatever. I but I could have chosen any number of things, to get good at those things or to, help with those things. I could have chosen any activity that would have helped me to do that, but I chose kickboxing specifically because I was interested in cultivating the specific skills required for it. I didn't take up running because I didn't wanna run. I didn't, take up Pilates because I wasn't interested in that. Like, so if you come to an activity, you need to be interested. You need to have a high enough level of interest to develop the skills associated with that activity itself, as well as the secondary goals that you might be hoping to get from it. Um, so, this is one of the reasons that I made the shift to work with adult students because they, may not have the time to practice always or the time to devote to music in the way that they want, with all the things that are happening in their adult lives, but they are invested in the learning process and they are invested in building a skill. And even on weeks when they haven't practiced, they know, that they can still come to their lessons and they engage thoughtfully and they ask questions, that incite valuable discussions that are still going to help them learn, even if they haven't engaged with their material in the way that they would have liked over the week. And I'm of the opinion that no matter what you do in life, whatever hobbies or activities or profession that you do in life should be approached with a growth mindset. Because if you're not growing, you are stagnating at best and you are regressing at worst. So everything from music to health and fitness and spirituality and hobbies, like all of this should be approached with a growth mindset because all of them involve either literal or figurative muscles that we must build, to become more proficient at the thing. We should always be trying to, be better than the person that we were yesterday, than the version of ourselves that existed yesterday. And, we all have external results and reasons that, come about as a result of these things, right? Like we all have external reasons for wanting to exercise or wanting to study music, or wanting to develop more spirituality. But the intrinsic motivation should be that we want to get good at those things because those things are part of what make us as fully human as possible. And so music lessons are just one way to do that. So if music isn't where a student sees themselves, investing and spending time, then that's fine. There's other things that they can do as long as they are growing with something. That is the thing. They have to be growing with something. So the second reason, beyond the mindset piece and the way that they approach lessons, the second reason that I think students struggle to practice is a much more practical reason, and that is that practicing in and of itself is a skill. It is its own skill that requires practice. You have to practice to get good at practicing. Practicing is a much different skill than simply playing the instrument or performing on the instrument. Um, and they don't realize that practicing is a separate skill that they need to be able to build. And I think this bypasses even many teachers who tell their students what to practice, but not necessarily the way in which they should do it or the way in which they should approach it. But it is primarily the teacher's job to help them do this, right? Along with all the other musical skills that they will need to succeed at what they're doing. Um, I think that voice teachers in particular could afford to focus more on the skill of practice and building the skill of practice. I have a colleague who is very good at doing this. She is very good at breaking down the practice process for her students who are adults, and she's very good at also motivating them and keeping them accountable. And I'd like to see more teachers do that, more voice teachers do that. Because if the student does not yet have a systematic way of thinking about these things, they need a system in place, at least to get started. Then they can decide if that system works for them. And you can work with them to change that and tweak that. But if you don't give them something to work with in the first place, it is going to be very hard for them to insert themselves in this process in a meaningful way. Again, I think back to my journey as a violinist. My teacher, again, was very specific about how many times I had to play certain passages. But also, especially as I got more advanced, the specific way that I was to be thinking about them and executing them. And how that was going to all be solidified as I progressed. Because when I became a singer, in high school, college, around that age, um, the practice advice, really left a lot to be desired. I got a lot of advice on, how to choose repertoire. I got lots of, ideas for vocalises that I found were helpful to me. And certainly there was lots of technical instruction in my lessons, but there was no proposed system of how to take the technique that you worked on in lessons and implement that in the practice room, especially when it came to the repertoire. So it's like, how do we get from the granular, point A to actually the point of the technique, which is singing the music? How do we get to point B with that? There was very little instruction to be had, unfortunately. And I think a lot of voice teachers kind of fall into that camp, unfortunately. So, uh, and I think that's because, a lot of singers went through an experience like mine. They were not particularly taught how to practice or how to practice well. They weren't taught early on in their training how to do it in a systematized, results driven way, where they take these isolated techniques and they work on isolated techniques, but then how do they plug them into the bigger picture? And, then these singers, right, they go on to become voice teachers and they teach from their own experience. And the cycle kind of continues. And I think, over time, some students will figure this out. I figured it out eventually. A lot of my colleagues, my singer colleagues, figured it out. They learned how to practice, but probably not without a lot of frustration. And a lot of uncertainty, being like, am I doing it right? What should I do? Should I spend time on this? Should I not spend time on this? So I think that students need to be shown what to practice, but they also need to be taught what the goals of a practice session are or what they should be. in the context of what the students, what their needs are, what their goals are, what their desires are. And we need to show them like sort of multiple different ways that they can engage with the same ideas in order to really solidify those connections in their brain that are going to help technique really take root and musicianship really take root in them. Because otherwise they feel like they end up sort of spinning their wheels and practicing. That there tends to be a lot of friction around practicing, and when it comes to getting our students to practice, we want to lessen the friction as much as we can. And part of that is like, in some cases, giving them a step by step process if that's what they want or need, um, in terms of how to practice. Because that's ultimately what it comes down to. If there is less friction around practicing from a logistical and a mindset/emotional standpoint, they'll be more likely to do it. So, if we can help them cultivate the mindsets and cultivate the skills to practice, that is what ultimately is going to help them. Because again, if we want music to be continued, if we want to people to continue to view it as a beautiful art form and something that is an essential part of humanity and an essential part of society, then we need to treat it that way in how we train it. And that includes young musicians. It includes those littles who are doing music for the first time. And it includes the adults who are doing it either as professionals or as hobbyists, avocational musicians, because they're all on a journey of growing and becoming more human, and they have chosen music to be a part of that journey for them. So we owe it to them to give them the tools to use this beautiful form of expression to serve them in whatever way that they want. So that concludes today's podcast. I thank you for tuning in and for listening, and I will see you next Tuesday for our next topic. We're going to be talking a little bit more about vocal pedagogy and instrumental pedagogy in the context of the student-teacher relationship again. So I will see you next week, and I hope you all have a fantastic week in the meantime.